Hi Medicos, good day to all of you. So this is Dr. BK for you, and today I will be talking about the peritoneum or the peritoneal cavity. Now, generally there is a notion that peritoneum is a very complicated structure. Understanding the peritoneum is very difficult, it is very confusing and so on. But actually speaking, it is not so. If you understand the basic concepts, then naturally you can understand the peritoneum or the disposition of the peritoneum over the various organs very easily. So in this session, I will be trying to keep it simple as much as possible, and not only that, I will be discussing peritoneum in two classes. So today, in the first part of this peritoneum class, I will be mainly touching upon the basics of the peritoneum. So naturally, a short introduction of actually what is peritoneum and how it is developed. Then the layers of the peritoneum, followed by which the folds of the peritoneum and its classification. So numerous folds, how they are named, the names of certain folds, what is their meaning, and how do you actually classify these folds. Followed by that, so subdivisions of the peritoneal cavity. So basically, how the peritoneal cavity is broadly divided, and then we will trace the peritoneum vertically. So from above downwards, we will try to trace the peritoneum and understand. Now, before actually going into the peritoneum class, one advice I would like to tell to the learners who are trying to understand the concept of the peritoneum is, mainly, if you try and put your efforts, definitely you can understand the peritoneum. So only thing is, you should have the interest and the dedication. Then second thing is, repetition always pays in medicine. So it is actually repeating, reading, rereading, rereading and rereading. So how many times you reread, then naturally read and read and read, then you will have a better and a clear concept. First time when you read something, definitely it might be a bit confused. The second time you try to read, then what happens is you might get a bit of clarity. So like that third and fourth time. Now, one more thing, what I would like to actually speak mainly in this PPT is the purpose of actually preparing this PowerPoint presentations. Now these PowerPoint presentations, why actually I have preferred for PowerPoint presentation rather than using a blackboard or a chalk with blackboard or with colors, or you use a whiteboard with some markers and speak. Now two things why actually I choose to use this PowerPoint presentation is because many diagrams I am able to show you. So if you would have watched my lectures continuously, at least some of my lectures, 4 to 5 lectures. So with every slide I actually try to give more than 2 or 3 pictures with different views and orientation. So which means I try to select the best pictures which is available, and then I actually incorporate those pictures. Okay. Now, because of that, what happens is you are actually saving your time from searching for these pictures, especially the suitable pictures. The second point is the text material. Definitely these text material, what happens is it will be very useful for you during preparation for your exams. So that is why I also put the text material. So both these things definitely in a board teaching will not be possible. I can explain the concepts using a blackboard or for that matter any other aid, teaching aid, but so many diagrams with so many views, it won't be possible, and the text material it is not possible to write all the lines. So these text material with these diagrams, it can be used as a reference for you. What I am giving you, what I have put in my lectures is actually a concentration of all the resources which is available. So from these resources, I am actually trying to filter out and giving the most appropriate information. Okay. So now, with this short introduction, I will directly go into the peritoneum class. Now, first of all, what is actually peritoneum? It is nothing but a serous cavity. Peritoneal cavity is a serous cavity, and that cavity should be lined by a membrane, peritoneal membrane, which is a serous membrane. Okay. Now, in the body, there are so many cavities. You have seen in the thorax, we have discussed about the pleural cavity, then the pericardial cavity. So, likewise, here also we are discussing about the peritoneal cavity, the largest of the serous cavity which is present in our body, and it is lined by a serous membrane. So basically it is developed from a coelomic cavity. So I think most of you would have come across these terms, coelomates, in your biology NEET classes. So what are coelomates and acoelomates? Pseudocoelomates, all those things. We possess a true coelomic cavity. A true coelomic cavity is a cavity which is present around the organs, especially your gastrointestinal tract. Acoelomates will not have this coelomic cavity, they will be completely filled with the mesoderm. Or pseudocoelomates, again, they won't transmit the blood vessels through these peritoneal force. Okay, so that is why we have coelomic cavity. And how actually the coelomic cavity is developed? Because of the folding during the embryonic stage itself, embryo stage, we are once a bilaminar or a trilaminar disc, two-dimensional. This two-dimensional structure, when the two ends they fold and meet together. Okay. For example, you just spread your hands widely and then you try to act like you are want to hug somebody. Then your both the hands, what happens, which is spread widely and laterally, will actually come together in the front. If you imagine this act, then you have understood the lateral folding. Why we have to lateral folding takes place? Why this actually takes place? Then you try to take a plain paper which is two-dimensional. Then the two lateral ends of the paper you try to join. Then your paper will become tubular or cylindrical. So now the flat paper has actually become a three-dimensional paper. It is round and three-dimensional. So that is the main reason why actually the coelomic cavity develops. We acquire three-dimensional, as a result of it the coelomic cavity develops. And not only that, because of this, our body can be called as, GIT can be called as a tube inside a tube. our body wall itself completely becomes tubular, and the gut wall is actually suspended in the center of this tube as another tube. So that is why it is actually called as a tube inside a tube. So a simple representation, assuming that this is your peritoneal cavity. So the organ is entering into the peritoneal cavity. So as it is invaginating or pushing itself to the center, the cavity, the peritoneal cavity, then naturally the peritoneum is forming a covering over this organ or the viscera. And finally, through this fold which has travelled, it is transmitting the blood vessels, especially the arteries and the veins, through these folds. So now, the organ which was outside the peritoneum, now it has become intraperitoneal, and it is surrounded by the peritoneum. And slowly it occupies the space. So you have one layer of this serous membrane or the peritoneum which is adhered to the viscera. The other one, the original one, which actually present around your body wall, and the space between these two is your peritoneal cavity. So a very large space, but we don't have such large space because all the space has been occupied by the various viscera. As the viscera, they invaginate into this peritoneal cavity, and they bulge, they grow, they elongate, and thereby all the space is occupied by the viscera which enters into this cavity. So basic subdivisions I already told you. So this concept is actually applied same for the viscera and the pericardium. Pericardium also heart bulges into this cavity from behind. Okay. Same way both the lungs, they invaginate into the pleural cavity. Now, the abdominal cavity can be called as abdominopelvic cavity, which is lined by the peritoneum. Okay, it is actually lined by the peritoneum, the abdominopelvic cavity. The demarcation between the abdomen and the pelvis is the pelvic brim, or the uppermost border of the pelvic brim, which will be formed by the anterior border, sacral promontory, then anterior border of the ala of sacrum. Then you have the ilium, sharp border, medial border of the ilium, forming the linea semilunaris, arcuate line. Then you have the pectineal line of the pubis, and then the upper border of the pubic symphysis. All this will form a circular line. So above that circular line will be the two iliac crust, and the iliac bone will be present. So the true pelvic cavity will be bounded behind by the body of sacrum, and on either side by the hip bone, that is in front by the pubis, and the sides by the ilium. But anteriorly, what happens? It will be deficient, and it will be supplemented by the anterior abdominal wall. So inside this pelvic cavity, it is called as the true pelvis, where all the organs are present, mainly your internal organs of reproduction, okay, reproductive organs, and your lower part of your GIT and your excretory system is present. Now above that, which is bounded on either side by the ilium and the iliac fossa, that is called as the greater pelvis or the false pelvis. Into that space, the bladder comes when it is full. The uterus comes when it is bulged during pregnancy. And in children, the organs are actually abdominopelvic. They have not still entered into the lesser pelvis. As the growth proceeds, then they will go into that. So today, peritoneum is a large serous sac or cavity lined by the peritoneal membrane, which is a serous membrane. So it is also called as the mesothelium. Mesothelium. The cells lining is actually called as the mesothelium, and they are actually made up of simple squamous epithelium. So now what happens is, you will just see a short video of the folding of the embryo that will give again a better understanding of this foldings, so that a better understanding of the peritoneal cavity you will be able to understand. So that is a two-dimensional embryo, bilaminar germ disc, ectoderm and endoderm with mesoderm in between. So then it should be trilaminar. This is your amnion and the yolk sac. Now they have taken a section, you are able to see. So that is your amniotic cavity, yolk sac cavity. So notochord, this is the mesoderm. This is your extra embryonic coelom which will be present. Paraxial, intermediate and lateral plate mesoderm, intra-embryonic mesoderm. So slowly when the foldings are taking place, you are able to see what happens is the yolk sac is getting absorbed. Okay, the yolk sac is actually getting absorbed as the gut tube, and there is only narrow communication between your gut and the yolk sac, which is called as the vitalo-intestinal membrane. Same section, they are just taking the almost anterior part of the embryo, where actually the foregut is developed. So again you are able to see the intra-embryonic mesoderm, paraxial, intermediate and lateral plate dividing into somatopleuric, splanchnopluric. Now you see both the ends are approximating and they will completely seal off. So now we have the coelomic cavity. The splanchnopluric mesoderm forms your muscular layer of the gut tube. Okay. The splanchnopluric mesoderm forms, look, this splanchnopluric mesoderm forms the muscular layer of the gut tube, inner circular and outer longitudinal. The somatopleuric forms the body wall muscles, your external oblique muscle, internal oblique muscle, all those things. This is the peritoneal cavity, and which is lined by the serous membrane. Peritoneal membrane, mesothelium. Now slowly what happens is, this space will be occupied by so many viscera. Mainly the GIT itself will actually make lot of folds, coils of intestine, everything, and that space will be obliterated. And thereby, now in the sagittal plane, they are actually showing a diagram of the sagittal plane. So that is where the primitive heart is formed. This is your neural tube. So how the gut is incorporated, the foregut, midgut, hindgut. Below the allantois it is called hindgut. This is your yolk sac. This is your midgut region. This is your vitalo-intestinal duct. So that is how it forms. Just a quick review again. How the peritoneal cavity is formed. Paraxial mesoderm will give rise to your vertebra, muscles of the vertebral column. Intermediate mesoderm will give rise to genitourinary system. So now the flat embryo is becoming rounded and three-dimensional. That is how the gut is actually formed. So that will be the peritoneum surrounding this will be parietal, and this will be the visceral peritoneum, and this actually is the peritoneal cavity, which will be later reduced to a very thin potential space. So next, moving on to the peritoneum layers. Okay, so that is simple gut tube which is surrounded by the splanchnopluric mesoderm and then the peritoneum, which will form the visceral peritoneum. The other peritoneum lining your body wall will form the parietal peritoneum. So peritoneum basically is of two layers or double layered, the parietal layer and the visceral layer. So here you are able to see this space after complete development will be occupied by the viscera, and you don't see such large space. It is just reduced to be a thin potential space. So it consists of two layers. One is actually the parietal layer, which is adhered to the interior of the body wall, and the visceral layer, which is in close approximation to the viscera, that is called as the visceral layer. So parietal layer is fibroelastic and it lines the wall of the abdomen. So anterior abdominal wall, lateral, and then it also lines the posterior abdominal wall. Posterior abdominal wall. Okay, this is back region, not here. Posterior abdominal wall it lines. Now, if you trace the parietal layer below the abdomen, it reflects on top of the viscera, pelvic viscera, and in between the spaces it will dip down in between this pelvic viscera. Then after reflecting on top of the pelvic viscera, especially your rectum and urinary bladder in case of males. In females, between the rectum and urinary bladder, you also have the uterus. So on top or to some extent to the sides, it will reflect, and then again it is coming back to the anterior abdominal wall. To some extent, since it is a fibroelastic, so it should allow distension of this wall. It provides strength to this wall. Okay, even though there are layers of the anterior abdominal vessel, so it is fibroelastic. To some extent, it provides strength, whereas the inner layers are not at much elastic like this, and it is a thin layer made up of mesothelium. So I told you what is mesothelium. It is made up of simple squamous epithelium. Mesothelium. Same way, the simple squamous epithelium in the blood vessel, you call it as endothelium. Okay, the simple squamous epithelium, again in some places it lines, okay, the inner tubes. So as I told you, it is by the simple squamous epithelium. So basically, parietal layer, visceral layer. Parietal layer is adhered to the interior of your walls, anterior and posterior abdominal wall. It is somewhat fibrous and elastic. The visceral layer is actually applied onto the viscera, more in close intimation or close intimacy to the abdominal viscera. So between these two layers, there is a fluid which is secreted, which is called as the peritoneal fluid, and it is a thin film of fluid, okay, because the space between these two layers itself is reduced. So basically we have seen it is a single large space, and the viscera usually project from behind. They invade or enter or push. This, where all they push, the posterior layer and this layer will approximate. So this layer will actually surround the viscera, forming the visceral peritoneum due to invagination of the viscera. So now you are able to see the large space has been invaginated by so many viscera, and because of this, the parietal layer and the visceral layer, there is only a thin film of fluid. The original peritoneal cavity is reduced to a thin potential space. Thin potential space you see here. Okay. So visceral peritoneum, all this is visceral peritoneum. Visceral peritoneum, they are all investing the viscera, and usually they form, you see, double layered folds. They are all double layered fold. All these are double layered fold, which you are able to see here. Visceral peritoneum usually forms double layered fold when they invest the viscera. So based on the organs they invest, we have different names: omentum, mesocolon, mesentery, and so on. Sometimes they are also called as ligaments, peritoneal ligaments. So all these we will try to see one by one. So basically, what is the difference between the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum? I told you the parietal peritoneum is developed from the somatopleuric intra-embryonic mesoderm. So it will show all characters and modalities of your body wall, blood supply, sensations, and all those things. So mainly lines the parietes are the walls, simple disposition, not much complicated. You just make a single sheet. Okay, so it will just make a simple continuous sheet of layer inside your or interior of your body wall. So it is innervated by body wall muscles, somatic nerves, spinal nerves. So it is sensitive to all sensations, body sensations, pain sensations, temperature, pricking sensations, and so on. So as I told you, it is developed from somatopleuric layer of intra-embryonic mesoderm. Visceral peritoneum, when this is actually lining the wall or the parietes, this will line the viscera, serosa layer, the outermost layer of your most of your gastrointestinal organs is actually serous layer, because it is nothing but the visceral peritoneum. Very complex disposition, because it is reflecting from one viscera to other viscera, or it might connect your viscera to the body wall, whether anterior or posterior body wall, and so on. So thereby its disposition is very complex. Insensitive to the somatic sensation doesn't mean that no sensations are there, which means it shows sensations of the viscera. So visceral pain sensations, sensations of pressure, distension, all those things are actually we can experience in the visceral peritoneum, and it is developed from the splanchnopluric layer of intra-embryonic mesoderm. So that is the main difference between the parietal peritoneum and the visceral peritoneum. Now, I told you that the viscera, they invaginate into the simple peritoneal cavity, and thereby what happens is that peritoneal cavity is reduced to a potential space. So, do all viscera invaginate into the peritoneal cavity? Not necessary. So, based on their covering of peritoneum, we can classify them into intraperitoneal. Intraperitoneal, the exact sense is it is covered by peritoneum on all the sides. So, in front as well as behind, or here you can see the liver, front, behind, below, above, and so on. So those peritoneum, those viscera are the organs which are covered by peritoneum on all sides are actually called as the intraperitoneal structures. Next, we have retroperitoneal structures. Retro means behind, so which is lying behind the peritoneal cavity. To tell it exactly, it is covered by peritoneum only on the anterior surface. So the pancreas, no peritoneum behind, only in the front it is covered by the peritoneum. There is one good example of retroperitoneal organs. Some of the retroperitoneal structures you are seeing is, as I told you, the pancreas, kidney, suprarenals, your second, third and fourth part of duodenum, ascending colon, descending colon, they all are actually retroperitoneal organs. Now, certain organs we can also call it as secondarily retroperitoneal, which means originally they were peritoneal, but during the process of development they have become retroperitoneal. One good example of that secondary retroperitoneal organ is your duodenum. So duodenum is a part of foregut. The primitive gut, it is a C-shaped loop which is intraperitoneal. But during the rotation of the stomach, the duodenum comes to lie to the right side and gets approximated to the posterior abdominal wall and loses its peritoneal covering posteriorly. Okay, so because it is approximated, that actually might disappear by a process called zygosis. So only it is covered by peritoneum on the anterior aspect. So that is one example of organs becoming secondarily retroperitoneal. Then you have extraperitoneal, those which lie outside the peritoneal cavity. So what is that outside the peritoneal cavity? There cannot be anything outside the peritoneal cavity because we all know the parietal peritoneum lines the whole of the walls. Then how can something be outside the peritoneal cavity? Precisely speaking, or if you look logically, all the organs which we considered as intraperitoneal are extraperitoneal, because what can be present between the two layers of the peritoneum? Nothing but the peritoneal fluid, and that is the original peritoneal cavity. Because this layer originally was here. When the liver slowly grew and pushed it, the original cavity which was large is being reduced to a potential space. So between these two layers, nothing is present. So then, whether it is the liver or stomach or your coils of intestine, all those things can be considered as extraperitoneal. Because between the two layers, parietal and the visceral peritoneum, you have only the peritoneal fluid. Now this extraperitoneal, not to be confused with extraperitoneal tissue. The layers of abdomen, we speak about from skin, superficial fascia, then you have external oblique, internal oblique, transverse abdominis, fascia transversalis. Then you have extraperitoneal tissue, and then you have the parietal peritoneum. So between your wall and the parietal peritoneum, there is a loose areolar tissue which is actually called as the extraperitoneal tissue. So far we have had a brief idea about how the peritoneal cavity came into existence because of the folding of the embryo. Followed by that, we have seen basically peritoneum is classified into two layers or disposed into two layers, that is the parietal layer and the visceral layer. We have seen the properties of the parietal layer and the visceral layer. Then we have discussed about what are all the structures, definition of the intraperitoneal, retroperitoneal and extraperitoneal. Now just see the list of organs which are all called as intraperitoneal organs. Your stomach, first centimeter, proximal 1 centimeter, immediately succeeding the stomach. After the pylorus, the first 1 centimeter of duodenum is inside the peritoneal cavity. Then you have the coils of intestine, that is your jejunum and your ileum. Then you have cecum and appendix, followed by the transverse colon, no ascending colon, only the transverse colon. Then you have sigmoid colon. Okay. And then what you have, spleen and of course your liver. These are all called as intraperitoneal structures. They are covered by peritoneum. On the front, behind. Retroperitoneal structures is, except the proximal 1 centimeter, the remaining of duodenum, all the posterior abdominal wall structures, kidney, suprarenal, pancreas, ureters, ascending colon, descending colon, rectum and gallbladder. Gallbladder is actually covered by peritoneum only on the inferior surface. Okay. The superior surface, which is adherent to the liver, is the fossa for gallbladder. Again, this is not covered by the peritoneum. The small part of the gallbladder which projects beyond the inferior border of the liver is actually called as the fundus of gallbladder. So that is again only part of the gallbladder which is intraperitoneal or covered by the peritoneum on both the sides. Okay. So general idea about the intraperitoneal and retroperitoneal structures, especially these duodenum. Okay. Your ascending, descending colon are all secondary retroperitoneum. Initially they had peritoneum, but during the process of the rotation and midgut rotation and rotation of the stomach, naturally they lose their peritoneum and they are fixed to the posterior abdominal wall. Okay. So, and finally, definitely the abdominal part of the esophagus is also not covered by the peritoneum. Now, if you look at the difference between the male and female peritoneal cavity, in male, the peritoneum is actually a closed sac, which means you take from any point from the umbilicus, it lines the interior of the anterior abdominal wall, then it reflects onto the diaphragm, then posterior abdominal wall, then it reflects below on top of the pelvic viscera, then again comes to the anterior abdominal wall. So it is completely closed. Whereas in case of the females, it is open. See, what happens is from the sigmoid colon, if you trace, the peritoneum is reflected onto the front and sides of the rectum and it forms pararectal fossa. Then it dips below between the rectum and the uterus as the recto-uterine pouch. Then it covers the upper surface and then it goes to the sides. Forms a double layer which is called as the broad ligament. It's called as the broad ligament. Then what happens? It then forms on either side of the urinary bladder, paravesicular fossa, and then covers on top of the urinary bladder. Now, the uterine tube, which is actually present between the two layers of the broad ligament, it actually pierces and comes to open near the ovary. So, naturally, there is an opening in the peritoneal cavity. So, that is why in female it is open. Open means it is not completely open, you have an opening. So, it is not a completely closed cavity in case of females. So, naturally through this uterine tubes, uterus, cervix of the uterus and vaginal canal, the peritoneal cavity communicates with the exterior. Okay. And near to the ovary, again what happens is, usually the whole of the peritoneum is actually lined by serous membrane, simple squamous epithelium. But here the peritoneum is actually lined by the cuboidal epithelium. So that is also one more difference to be noted in case of the female peritoneal lining. Okay, surface of the ovary, it is actually lined by the cuboidal epithelium. Now coming to the peritoneal folds. So various peritoneal folds, and you remember a couple of slides back I told you the visceral peritoneum mainly forms double layered folds. Okay, double layered fold of visceral peritoneum. They are called as peritoneal folds, and also they are called as ligaments. So we will see what is peritoneal folds, various peritoneal folds. So mainly you are able to see this viscera, a primitive gut tube for our understanding, a simple representation. From here it has invaginated and it has taken a double layered fold. And through this double layered fold, you are able to see this blood vessel is giving branches. So naturally, this main arterial trunk is giving branches. Here, this is a primitive gut tube can be divided into foregut, midgut, and hindgut. And naturally, the artery of foregut, the celiac trunk, midgut, superior mesenteric, and the inferior mesenteric artery is the artery of the hindgut. Mainly these folds transmit blood vessels. Along with the blood vessels, even the nerves, lymphatics are seen through these folds. Now, originally the whole gut tube and the fold which is suspending the gut tube is called as the mesentery. It is called as the mesentery. But after development, that mesentery, the term mesentery then is only used only with respect to the coils of intestine, namely your jejunum and ileum. The peritoneal fold of the jejunum and ileum alone is called as the mesentery, whereas the other peritoneal folds, the names differ, like omentum for the folds which connect the stomach with the other viscera. Okay, so which connect the stomach with the other viscera, you call them as omentum. You have greater omentum and then you have lesser omentum. Greater omentum between the stomach and transverse colon. So between stomach and transverse colon, it is greater omentum. Between the stomach and liver, it is called as lesser omentum. Mesentery suspends the coils of intestine from the posterior abdominal wall. This I already told you. Then you have mesocolon for the transverse colon. Okay. Suspends the transverse colon from posterior abdominal wall. Then you have mesoappendix and sigmoid mesocolon. Okay. They are peritoneal folds suspending the sigmoid colon and the mesoappendix. Appendix is suspended by the peritoneal fold, which is called as the mesoappendix. So, we have seen these are actually some of the peritoneal folds and their nomenclature, how they are named as mesentery, omentum, mesocolon, mesoappendix, and so on. Now, we will see what are peritoneal ligaments. So that connect the viscera to abdominal wall or other viscera. So when it is running between two viscera or to the abdominal wall, it is called as the peritoneal ligament. Gastrosplenic ligament, lineo-renal ligament. This will connect your stomach to the spleen, gastrospleen. Lineo-renal will connect your spleen to the kidney. It is called as lineo-renal ligament. Then you have phrenicocholic ligament, your colon to the diaphragm, coronary ligaments. Okay. So this is with respect to the liver, you see the coronary ligaments. Then falciform ligament, which is like a sickle shape, that is why it is called as falciform ligament. Now don't worry about all these ligaments because I will be discussing about these ligaments in the peritoneum class itself, or else whatever which is left out will again be taken for discussion while we deal with the peritoneal relations of the particular viscera. So during the stomach class, what happens is again peritoneal relations, these folds might repeat. So liver, peritoneal relations of liver. So again with respect to viscera, their peritoneal relations, again we will be covering in that. So lesser omentum extends from the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach. Okay. So it has got two parts, not only to the lesser curvature, also to the proximal part of the duodenum. So it has a hepatoduodenal part. Hepato means liver, hepa, and hepatogastric part. In the right free margin of the lesser omentum, you have hepatic artery, bile duct, and portal vein. Hepatic artery is actually present to the left, bile duct to the right, and portal vein behind these two. And between the two layers of the lesser omentum, you have the right and left gastric arteries, anastomosis. So, in the right free margin of lesser omentum, you see the bile duct, hepatic artery, and between these two and behind what you see is the portal vein. So, all these three structures are present in the right free margin of the lesser omentum. The lesser omentum has been actually removed, cut off from the lesser curvature so that you are able to see these structures. Behind that you are able to see a part of pancreas, abdominal aorta, which is giving the celiac trunk, its three main branches, and more posteriorly the inferior vena cava. All those things you are able to see when you just ligate the lesser omentum. The attachment to the liver has got a horizontal part and a vertical part. The vertical part is not shown here in this picture, fissure for ligamentum venosum. Anyway, I will be discussing about that in the peritoneal relations of the liver. Horizontal part is around the porta hepatis, where actually the hepatic artery and portal vein enters and the common hepatic duct comes out to form the bile duct. So, horizontal part around the margins of the porta hepatis and vertical part behind the fissure for ligamentum venosum. So, between the two layers, as I told you, on the right and left gastric vessels. Then you have some lymph nodes, lymphatics, and also nerves, mainly branches of the vagus nerve. The greater omentum is actually related to the greater curvature of the stomach, and mainly it is present between the stomach and the transverse colon. Okay. Not only that, it extends beyond that and covers the coils of intestine like an apron. Okay. Or you can tell like a wheel or apron. It actually covers the coils of intestines. It is mainly made up of 4 layers. First layer, second layer. These 2 layers again turn back to form the third and fourth layer. After puberty, the inner 2 layers, the second and third layer fuses. Okay, so you won't be able to appreciate, or space between these 2 layers is obliterated because the second and the third layer, they fuse with each other. It is also called as the policeman of the abdomen because it limits the spread of infections by moving to the area of infection, and they form adhesions. So that I will again speak in the end of the peritoneum class in the clinical aspects. So that will come in the second part of this peritoneum lecture. So greater omentum from the greater curvature hangs downwards, made up of 4 layers as I told you. So only during development these 4 layers can be appreciated. First 2 layers, then again they turn back to form the third and fourth layer. The third and second and third layer, they fuse, except near to the stomach, few layer, the small space is present, unfused part, which serves as the inferior recess of lesser sac. The fourth layer, this fourth layer will fuse to the peritoneal covering of the transverse mesocolon, the peritoneal fold which is actually covering the transverse colon. Okay, so the anterior superior surface of the transverse colon will be covered by this fourth layer fused with the transverse mesocolon. And along the line of attachment to the anterior border of pancreas and also to the second part of duodenum. So the greater omentum gastrophilic ligament. So that is the extension which you can see between the stomach and the transverse colon. Then between the stomach and the spleen as the gastrosplenic ligament. Between the spleen and the kidney as the lineo-renal ligament. Lineo-renal ligament between the spleen and the kidney. Lineo-renal. Between the stomach and the spleen, it is the gastrosplenic ligament. You also have one more ligament, gastrophrenic. Between the cardiac end of the stomach and the left crus of the diaphragm, it is called as the gastrophrenic ligament. So mainly it consists of right and left gastroepiploic arteries, and gastrosplenic will have short gastric arteries. Lineo-renal will have splenic arteries. So apart from that, you also have collection of macrophages, fat. Next, you see this is the transverse colon. This is a sagittal section which is covered by its peritoneum. Transverse mesocolon suspends the transverse colon from the posterior abdominal wall. Transverse mesocolon is a intraperitoneal structure. The root of the transverse mesocolon extends from the second part of the duodenum to the body of the pancreas. Okay. Here antero-superior, posterior-inferior surface which is covered by the peritoneum, the first, second, third and fourth layer of the greater omentum fuses with the anterior layer of transverse mesocolon. Okay. So here you are able to see the transverse mesocolon, and within that we have the middle colic arteries, middle colic vessels, which divides into right and left branch, mainly supplying the transverse colon. Middle colic artery, again it is a branch of the superior mesenteric artery. Next, coming to the mesentery, fold of peritoneum, which is a broad fan-shaped fold, suspends the gut tube from the posterior abdominal wall. It has got an attached border and it has got a free border. Attached border is called as the root of the mesentery. Free border encloses the coils of jejunum and ileum. Okay. Attached border is only 6 inches in length, whereas the free border is 6 meters. So that is why you see these frills or folds in the mesentery like a pleats. So as I told you, free border encloses the jejunum and ileum. So this has got a right layer and it has got a left layer, mesentery, double layered fold. This side what you are seeing now is the right layer of the mesentery. That side what you will see is the left layer of the mesentery. So mainly it allows the free movements or coils of the intestine. Motility of the gut is mainly the mesentery should allow it. And if you look, the fat is more concentrated near to the root rather than the free border. Concentration is near to the root, that is near the posterior abdominal wall. You are able to see here that is the attached border from the duodenojejunal junction, okay, called as the root of mesentery, and goes to the cecal, ileocecal junction. Fat is more concentrated at the root. So from the duodenojejunal flexure to the ileocecal junction, L2 to right sacroiliac joint. So that is the extension of the root or the fixed border of the mesentery, and the root crosses the following structures. Third part of duodenum, mainly It crosses the third part of duodenum, abdominal aorta, ureter, psoas major muscle, superior mesenteric artery, gonadal artery, which is going to come from the aorta. So that is the white color line is the fixed border on the root of mesentery. So third part of duodenum, as I told you, abdominal aorta, IVC, right gonadal vessels, ureter, and right psoas major muscle. These are the structures crossed. So it will have one layer, it will have another layer. That is the left layer. Then again it will be continuous, and that will cover the peritoneum in front of the ascending colon. Then here right layer will cover the peritoneum in front of the descending colon. Then it will be continuous with the parietal peritoneum. So what are the contents of the mesentery? You all know that it contains mainly coils of jejunum ileum. Then it also contains superior mesenteric artery, jejunal and ileal branches, nerves, lymphatics, fat. Fat is again a very genuine content of the mesentery. Okay. So jejunum, ileum, superior mesenteric vessels and its jejunum and ileal branches, lymphatics, nerves and fat. These are the contents of the mesentery. Mesoappendix. So almost a triangular fold of peritoneum near to the ileum from the posterior wall of the mesentery or posterior layer of the mesentery. It encloses the appendix. Occasionally it fails to reach the tip of the appendix. Okay. Occasionally. So if it is failed to reach, then naturally what happens is, in case of the appendicitis, the tip is more prone for gangrene. And this fold mainly transmits the appendicular artery, that is about the mesoappendix. Then here sigmoid colon, which has its own peritoneal covering, which is actually called as the sigmoid mesocolon. It is like a V shape. The apex of the V is attached near to the left common iliac artery, bifurcation of left common iliac artery, apex. Then it has got two limbs, the right limb and the left limb, through which it suspends the sigmoid colon from the pelvic wall, that is the posterior or the lateral pelvic wall. Okay. So it is somewhat V-shaped, and mainly it transmits the superior rectal vessels and nerves, which is a branch of inferior mesenteric artery. So that is the sigmoid colon, and the fold is the sigmoid mesocolon. It will have a right limb and a left limb and an apex. So it transmits the superior rectal vessels, sigmoid mesocolon. Now, if you look at the peritoneal cavity, broadly is divided into greater sac and lesser sac. The whole green color thing, what you see is the greater sac, which is present in front of the stomach, below, and definitely it extends far beyond that. But for the sake of understanding, we immediately tell what is present in front of the stomach is the greater sac, because lesser sac lies behind the stomach, and also the liver and the lesser omentum. Okay. That is the lesser sac. Lesser sac is a reserved space for the distended stomach. Okay. The whole of the peritoneal cavity can be divided into the lesser sac, which is behind the stomach, and the green color one is the greater sac. So greater sac, why it is called greater sac, because that forms the major part of the peritoneal cavity. The other name for the lesser sac is the omental bursa. It is actually called as the omental bursa. Lesser sac and the greater sac communicate behind the right free margin of lesser omentum. And that opening is called as the epiploic foramen. So through the epiploic foramen, there is a communication between the greater sac and the lesser sac. Okay. So lesser sac is behind the stomach, lesser omentum and the liver. So finally we have come to the vertical tracing of the peritoneum. So I will just keep it simple as possible, because first try to understand in a simpler format, then we can slowly understand the complicated things. So let us start from here. Umbilicus, this is the anterior abdominal wall, abdominal muscles. Parietal peritoneum. From here, if you start, the parietal peritoneum lines the interior of the anterior abdominal wall. Then it lines the under surface of the diaphragm and then reflects on top of the liver, covering the liver. Between the liver and the umbilicus, there is a sickle-shaped fold of peritoneum which is called as the falciform ligament. So it simply invests the liver, which is not so easy as I told. The second part, you will see the peritoneal reflections of the liver. Okay, for the time being, let us understand from the umbilicus. Interior, it lines the inner part of the anterior abdominal wall, under surface of the diaphragm, and then it reflects on top of the liver, covers the liver, and from there to the liver as lesser omentum it comes. 2 layers of the lesser omentum. This lesser omentum again splits to enclose the stomach, and then below the stomach these 2 layers form the first 2 layers of the greater omentum. Then what happens is the greater omentum, first and second layer, turns backwards as the third and fourth layer. Then it again splits to enclose the transverse colon, and then it reflects from the transverse colon to the anterior surface of kidney as the transverse mesocolon. At the anterior border of the kidney, the 2 layers of the transverse mesocolon, they split. One goes above, covering the anterior surface of the pancreas. Sorry, I was using the term kidney, it is the pancreas. Again, I will repeat, from the transverse mesocolon, along the anterior border of pancreas, it splits into a superior and an inferior layer. The superior layer covers the pancreas, then posterior abdominal wall, then diaphragm, and again reflects back to the liver. So we have come almost to one point. Now the inferior layer comes down, forms again a double layered fold called mesentery, which invests all the coils of intestine. Double layered fold. Then it reflects onto the posterior abdominal wall. There again, in case of the sigmoid colon, it will come front to form sigmoid mesocolon. Then it reflects in front of the rectum and sides of the rectum. There it will form pararectal fossa. Then it will reflect on top of the urinary bladder as the rectovesicular fossa. Okay. In between these two, in females, the uterus will be there. It will reflect on top of the uterus. Between the uterus and the rectum, recto-uterine pouch. Then if you trace laterally, it will form 2 layers of the broad ligament. Bladder, it reflects on top of the bladder. If you go sideways, you see the paravesicular fossa. Then from the bladder, it is again reflecting onto the anterior abdominal wall and comes to the umbilicus. In the midline, if you see, again it will form a double layered fold, median umbilical ligament. Then you have medial and lateral umbilical ligaments. So they are this medial and lateral umbilical ligaments are the only folds of the parietal peritoneum. Other place, the parietal peritoneum does not form any double layered fold. Okay. So quick recap. From the umbilicus, it starts as parietal peritoneum, reflects on top of the liver, then reflects as lesser omentum, 2 layers, invests the stomach. These 2 layers again join to form the greater omentum, first 2 layers. These first 2 layers turn back as third and fourth layers, splits to enclose the transverse colon. Then again forms double layer transverse mesocolon. At the pancreas anterior border, both layers of transverse mesocolon split into ascending and descending. Ascending goes to line the posterior abdominal wall, parietal peritoneum, and then again to the liver. Below, if you trace posterior abdominal wall, it comes as double layered fold to invest the coils of jejunum and ileum. Then again goes back to the posterior abdominal wall. Again it might come in case of sigmoid colon as sigmoid mesocolon. Then reflects in front and sides of the rectum, forms the rectovesicular pouch, reflects on top of the urinary bladder, and then continues along the anterior abdominal wall up to the umbilicus. So that is all for today. Thank you very much for your patient listening.